Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session titled Working in Extreme Heat. We're very happy to have Dr. Andreas Flouris joining us today. He's a professor of physiology at the University of Thessaly and a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa. And he specializes in the health and productivity impacts of climate change and has been working for a very long time looking at this issue of heat stress along with other researchers and as well as advising international bodies contributing to occupational health and climate policy. And he has really been recognized for his research on Time 100's Next List, and his work spans over 15 years. He's a great mentor to postgraduate students in environmental physiology and health, and he is serving on the VIN Future Prize Committee for his commitment to climate action. So thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Zonabel Woods, and I'm a senior social development specialist here at the Asian Development Bank, headquartered in Manila. And we are running these learning series as part of a technical assistance project that we have that is looking at strengthening women's resilience to heat stress. We are working in 5 countries in the region, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Tajikistan, and in Bangladesh, and in Pakistan. Sorry, I sometimes get some of the order of the countries a little bit confused, but those are the 5 countries that we're working in. We are focusing on 3 really critical areas. One of them is around knowledge to ensure that we are increasing the existing gap in knowledge and raising awareness of how women are being affected by increased heat. The second is working with developing member countries in looking at different interventions, including heat action planning. And finally, working with our colleagues here at ADB to incorporate gender responsive designs to strengthen women's resilience to heat stress. So we're very happy to have Andreas with us today, who will make a presentation, and we're leaving a bit of time for question and answer. And I really hope that we will have a good discussion this afternoon with Andreas. And thank you, Andreas, for making the time to be with us today. So with that, I'll hand it over to you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Friday. Maybe for some of you it's morning, but Friday afternoon already for those of us in Manila. And we really appreciate you being here. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for the great introduction and the opportunity to be here and talk to you about something that is really close to my heart. A good afternoon for those of you joining us in Southeast Asia. Good morning to those in Europe. Good evening to others. Let me share my screen. Just give me a second. I hope you can see it okay. So in the next about 20 minutes, I will talk to you about working in extreme heat. We will cover the health risks, adaptation measures, and the regulatory gaps, and what we can do, and what financial institutions and other stakeholders can do to address the issue. The information I will share with you will come mainly from 3 reports. One was published in late April by the International Labour Organization, and I had the opportunity to write it talked about climate change, and I had the opportunity to write the chapter on heat. And then there's information that I will present from 2 other reports that will be published. One by the ILO again, it will be published next week, and it focuses entirely on heat. And the other one is jointly published by the WHO and the WMO, and will be published hopefully by the end of the summer, and covers the impacts of climate change on occupational heat stress in general. A few months ago, I read a report by the WMO talking about the state of the climate in Asia. And you can see here the climate-related impacts and risks during 2023. And if we focus on the topic of this discussion today, we will see that there's only 5% extreme reported cases, and so out of the reported extreme scenarios, the extreme events, only 5% relate to temperature, and they cause only 8% of the deaths, which is of course an important percentage and an important problem, but it seems less important compared to others. Well, if that was the case, to be honest with you, I would be a very happy person, because addressing heat is a very important issue for me. But I'm here to unfortunately tell you that this is not the case. Looking at extreme events is only looking at a fraction of the issue. In the report that will be published next week by the ILO, we're showing that only 10% of the exposure for the working population is during a heat wave, whereas 90% of the heat exposure days for workers are outside these official crisis times. And if we look at the epidemiological data, if we look at the injuries that are caused by heat at the workplace, only 20% of those are happening during a heat wave period, whereas 80% of the occupational injuries and the productivity loss is happening outside of these crisis times during what we call a normal hot weather. So if we focus our attention only on heat waves, we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. And not only that, but the same report from the WMO shows that Asia is heating up much faster than the many other continents. It's actually just second to Europe, so it's heating up much faster than many other kind of regions of the planet. So first of all, looking at the heat waves and the extreme events is only looking at the tip of the iceberg, plus the average normal hot weather, as we call it, is getting much hotter and much more frequent. So it really is a problem that we need to address in the ADB region, and I was really happy to see the ADB really working towards this. So let's look a little bit about the impacts on health. Is there any information about that, and is it a significant issue to address? Well, in the report to be published next week, we're showing that across the world, there's nearly 23 million non-fatal occupational injuries every year linked and caused by exposure to heat at work. There's about 19,000 people who will go to work and not come back because their workplaces was hot. And there's nearly 2.1 million disability adjusted life years due to heat stress at work. And globally, these are 6.1% of the injuries that occur. 6.1 happen due to heat, and 6.3% of the disability adjusted life years are caused by heat stress. So it is an important issue to address, with thousands of deaths every year and millions of injuries. If we look at the regional distribution, and especially in Southeast Asia, we will see that in the ADB region, of course, we will see that this is not the case everywhere in the world. So there's, as you can see, there are many countries with darker colors where heat does not cause such a high percentage of occupational injuries. But there are other parts, and many of them are in the ADB region, where a lot of the accidents and the injuries are caused by heat. And you can see that many countries, such as that were in Southeast Asia, are in the top fraction, attributable fraction in terms of the percent of fatal occupational injuries that are attributable to heat stress. So it is an important aspect, especially in the ADB region. And looking at the injuries is only looking at what happens from an exposure in one day. but there's also other more chronic impacts. So working in a hot environment for a prolonged period of time, 2 or 3 months, maybe more sometimes, every year for many years in a row, this can cause long-term health effects, and chronic kidney disease is one of them, and probably the most devastating one. And we now know that there's more than 26 million people living with chronic kidney disease because they were working in an environment that was hot for many months and across many years. And you can see again in Southeast Asia, there's nearly 21 million people living with chronic kidney disease because of the fact that their workplace was hot. At the same time as the health problems that are emerging because of exposure to heat, there's also a parallel crisis, the crisis of reduced productivity due to heat stress. And in this map, you can see in the different quarters of the year, the impacts on productivity. And you can see that there's sometimes up to 30% productivity losses due to heat stress. And the reason here is when we're working in a hot environment and our body is getting increasing in temperature, we have what we call behavioral thermoregulation, and our brain tells us to slow down and take more breaks so that we can make sure that our body temperature does not increase beyond the level that is going to cause health issues. And in cases where this does not happen, either because the worker doesn't listen to what their brain tells them, or because the situation in at work doesn't allow that. And in these cases, when we don't listen to this voice, then we go back to the previous examples that I show when we have immediate injuries. But here we see that because of this little voice in the back of our head telling us to slow down, this causes productivity loss. So there's a loss-loss, lose-lose, I would say, situation here. We have the workers losing their health, but also we have the employers losing productivity. If we focus on our attention on the ADB region, you can see that there are significant impacts. In Q1, we have the south part of the ADB region having significant reductions in productivity. In Q2 and Q3, this moves north. And in Q4, there's almost the entire Southeast Asia is losing very high amounts of productivity. So this is an important aspect also to address, not only the impacts on health, but also the very important impacts on productivity. And one other important aspect is that the impacts on productivity actually seem to be much worse than we previously thought. The data that I just showed you, the maps, are based on previous models, which assumed that productivity is impacted when there's a lot of heat, when an index that we call wet bulb globe temperature rises beyond 27 or 28 degrees. Below that, previous models showed that there's absolutely no problem. There's zero impacts on productivity. However, more recent models are showing that actually workers are behaviorally thermoregulating, as we call it, and this issue on productivity starts happening in much cooler environments, starting from 25 degrees and up. And even more recent models coming from lab work show that actually the problem starts all the way from 15 degrees Celsius and up. And when we did a very large international study across 10 countries around the world, we showed in field settings where we actually did go to work sites and we measured people during their work on a second-by-second basis, and we analyzed this task analysis. We actually did see that problems on productivity start emerging all the way from 15 degrees Celsius and up. And when the new calculations merge and the new maps emerge, we will actually start seeing that the problem is much more widespread than we previously thought. So there's nearly no country in the world that is spared from the impacts of heat on productivity, making it an even more important issue to address. So talking about addressing the issue, In the report to be published next week from the ILO, we're looking at what countries are doing to address the problem. And we're taking an example of 21 countries around the world. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but it's 21 examples of countries that have binding legislation to address the problem, to protect workers, but also protect the employers and the productivity. And if we focus our attention on the ADB region, we're going to see that there's already 5 countries in the ADB region that have binding legislation that addresses the issue. It's China, India, Japan, Singapore, and Thailand. And in the ILO report, we're analyzing the different characteristics of these legislations. And you can see, first of all, that they have, all of them use an indicator to assess how much heat is at the workplace. China is using air temperature, India is using wet bulb temperature, and the 3 other countries are using a much more complex and, I would say, much better indicator known as the wet bulb globe temperature, or WBGT for short. And you can see that in most cases, these thresholds that they have depend on the either the extremity of the how extreme the heat is, or how intense the work is. And you can see that there are also different provisions, and there's also many other aspects in each legislation taken into consideration. Now, if we look at all the 21 countries, all the 21 examples from around the world that we assessed in that report, there are 10 characteristics that could be used as building blocks when we're trying to develop effective measures. And I will briefly go through each one of them. First one, of course, is participatory risk assessment that should integrate heat, the identification of vulnerable worker groups, such as, for example, those in informal economies, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, but also groups such as women or disabled individuals or people with chronic disease, that these situations make them more vulnerable to the impacts of heat. And I will go through that in more detail later on. Also, a very important building block is to assess very carefully the heat itself. And the recommended strategy is using the WBGT. Many studies around the world are showing that this indicator, instead of temperature, this indicator, the WBGT, is a much better way to assess what's happening in the worker's body. In a recent study that we did, when we ranked all the different indicators around the world that have been created by meteorologists and other experts, WBGT ranked as #1, whereas temperature, the environmental temperature that everybody is used to, ranked 21st in terms of its capacity to tell us how the worker's body is feeling. So it's much better to use the #1 instead of the 21st in line. The #4th building block is, of course, hydration, looking at hydration strategies, providing hydration to workers, including adequate sanitation facilities, especially for female workers, because often workers, and especially female workers, they don't drink enough water because they don't wish, or they can't sometimes safely use sanitation facilities. Another important building block is providing rest, breaks, or modified work schedules to limit exposure to heat, including, of course, the ability to self-pace and remove themselves from a dangerous situation, including heat. The provision of cool, shaded, and ventilated rest areas. Very importantly, looking at acclimatization, especially during the earlier part of the hot season, where workers are still not acclimatized yet to the heat. Providing personal protective equipment designed to protect workers from heat, educating and increasing awareness for the impacts of heat and heat-related illnesses, and of course, regular medical checkups and health monitoring. First of all, to make sure that the worker is fit enough to be exposed to a hot environment, but periodically monitor their health to make sure that they haven't developed a condition that makes them more susceptible. And since we're talking about susceptibility, in the report that will be published next week, we're looking at and we're reporting on the four general factors that make people more susceptible to heat-related illnesses. And you can see that there are personal, environmental, pharmacological, drugs, and pathological factors that are of importance. And if any of these are true for a worker, then this worker is much more sensitive to working in a hot environment, which means that many other colleagues would be in the same place doing the same work, but this particular person would have much higher risk for experiencing heat-related illnesses. And in the rest of my presentation, I will focus on the number one group that you can see here, women and especially pregnant women workers, because these are by far the most vulnerable group of workers out there. This is important because globally, especially in agriculture, women make up a significant number of workers, and especially in precarious and vulnerable situations such as lower wages and lack of cooling and water services and lack of toilet facilities around the world. And as I mentioned before, many studies have shown that women are more likely to have low heat tolerance and a higher risk of exertional heat illness than men do. But let's look at why this happens. What does the physiology tell us? Which still has some room to cover, but we already have quite a bit of evidence for this. So this evidence is showing that women at work have 3.7% times more likely, 3.7 times more likely to be heat intolerant than men when they're doing physical work. And why is this? Well, it is because women on average, of course, they have a higher percentage of body fat and lower aerobic fitness. Both these are two very important characteristics. Having low body fat and high aerobic fitness makes somebody much more tolerant to heat and much more able to dissipate the heat that is produced within their body when they're physically active. Also, a number of studies have shown that women tend, on average, of course, to sweat less than men. Therefore, they have much less capacity to get rid of the heat, dissipate the heat that they're producing, either because of the work that they're doing or because of the environment that is causing them to raise their temperature. If we focus even more so on average, we see that women are a very important vulnerable group. But if we focus on pregnant women workers, which are even more so vulnerable to this situation, it is important to look at them specifically because, as I said before, women, especially in agriculture, they make up almost half of the workforce, and many of them continue to work, especially in the developing world and also in the ADB region, continue to work manually during pregnancy, doing subsistence farming, and also many often very strenuous manual tasks around the house. And they often struggle with physical symptoms of heat, long and heavy workloads, and also very limited options to prevent heat stress. So, especially for pregnant women workers, evidence is emerging on this group. But what we know so far is that they are exposed to heat around 20% of their work shifts in regions of the world, such as West Africa and North America. They report higher rates of heat-related illness. They have increased core temperature compared to pregnant women who are not exposed to heat. And also women who are not pregnant, and also even more so men. They also have a reduced placental blood flow and increased fetal heart rate. So these two are very important for the outcome of their pregnancy, but also for their the maternal health. And I will go through even more in detail about this, talking to you about the study that was published a few months ago in India, where they analyzed 800 pregnant women, our collaborators from the group of Vidya Venugopal and colleagues. And they had a group of 800 women who about half of them were exposed to excessive heat at work. And those that were, they did confirm that they had a much higher maternal body temperature. And because of that, they were sweating a lot more. And unfortunately, they weren't drinking enough water during their work. And as a result, they had a higher prevalence for dehydration. Now, when they looked at the outcomes of the pregnancy, you can see that many outcomes were much higher, about twice or more higher chances of having miscarriage, stillbirth or preterm births, and low birth weight for the babies to be born. So this is a very important issue, especially for pregnant women workers and the pregnancy outcomes. And if we look at the timing of the exposure, women that were exposed during the first trimester had 3.1-fold higher risk for adverse pregnancy outcomes, especially because the first trimester, the chances of having a miscarriage, for example, is much, much higher compared to the other trimesters. Women that were exposed during the third trimester had twice more likelihood of having adverse birth outcomes. And those that were exposed during all trimesters had more than twice the likelihood of having both fetal and maternal adverse outcomes. So again, for this vulnerable group is really, really an important issue to address. And I will just finish with a study that we are doing right now, and in collaboration with the MRC unit, the Gambia, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, University of Cambridge as well. We're doing a large study in South Europe, in Greece, but also in the Gambia. We're currently conducting a systematic review, and we're right now in my lab in Greece, we're taking pregnant women and we're exposing them to heat in an environmental chamber that we have to see very carefully the mechanisms of the effect, because the information that I just described to you from India shows the epidemiological evidence and what heat is causing, but we don't know the mechanisms. And if we don't know the mechanisms, we can't really address the problem. So we're doing these careful lab studies in the environmental chamber to understand what are the mechanisms causing the impacts on maternal and fetal health. And then we're also expanding this work in looking at chronic heat with a prospective cohort study. And specifically, we're looking at all the mechanisms that you can see here. In the Gambia, we're recruiting about 800 women. About half will be from the capital, Banjul, that has a moderately hot environment. And another half will be from inland, the Gambia in Basse, which has a much hotter climate. And we want to see what are the outcomes on both fetal and maternal health of this difference in heat exposure. Then we're going to analyze placentas. We're taking biopsies of placentas to be analyzed and to look at the mechanisms. And then the idea is to take all this and co-design solutions with women's organizations and with policymakers in the Gambia, but also in other countries in Europe and also hopefully Southeast Asia. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to discussing this further with you.
Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation, Andreas. We have actually one very quick question, I think, regarding the report on heat stress and occupational OSH going to be, when is it going to be published? And maybe if you could share sort of the mechanism by how it's going to be shared.
Yeah, the unofficial date is next week. As far as I know, is July 3rd. So I think it's next Wednesday. There's going to be a press release by the International Labour Organization and will be posted on their website. Also, I will be sharing it through social media as well. And I'm sure the ILO is doing the same as well. So hopefully it will be easy for our audience here to get hold of it.
Okay. Great. So we are opening the floor for questions. So there's a Q&A going. And then there is also the chat. So I'm looking at both. So you're welcome to ask questions in both. There's kind of a comment, but also maybe Rohit, you'd like to also ask a question. But Rohit has been working in India and in the region quite a lot on heat action planning. So he's one of the pioneers in this field here in Asia, and he mentions that. The high vulnerability of women due to heat, due to physiological characteristics. He's very happy to hear that you're bringing that, because one of the challenges is that we often talk about women being more resilient, and so this assumption that women just kind of can continue to carry on more work and more harsh conditions, and this is where they become he mentions that this is where they become more marginalized in policy and in practice. So what do you think about that?
Absolutely, and also this is one of the other reasons why possibly or could be one of the mechanisms of the vulnerability to heat. So it's not only physiological, but it's also cultural. Let's not forget that there are three reasons why somebody's temperature is rising. Number one is the environment, of course, that adds heat to our body when we're exposed to high temperature or humidity or solar radiation or low wind. But there's also a very important mechanism of the physical activity, the work that we're doing. So people, and this is many times women who are a lot more active and take on a lot more work, either at home or in the workplace, they're a lot more likely to, generate a lot more heat internally. And often in many cultural settings, women also wearing a lot more clothing than men. And this is the third factor of importance about heat. So first is environment, second is physical activity, third is clothing. So women tend to be a lot more active during the day. They wear a lot more clothing, and often they are exposed to much hotter environments, such as kitchens, for example. And this makes them a lot more vulnerable to heat. So it's not only their physiology, but there's also the cultural environment and the way work is done and the way we lead our lives, where that makes women more vulnerable compared to men.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have another question from Olga Skotareva, and she's asking for an overview of maybe some available guidance that exist on the issues that you have mentioned, and particularly looking at solutions. So not only in terms of with regards to pregnant women, but also general issues that you highlighted in the beginning.
Yeah, there's a few reports that have been published in general about there's actually many reports from different organizations such as the WHO, for example, WMO, that talk about the general public. So there's a lot of information about how to protect the general population. And also some vulnerable groups such as individuals with chronic disease or the elderly, for example. There's not a lot of published yet literature and reports and solutions on working people. And we're hoping that we're addressing this gap in the reports that will be published next week by the ILO and in a few weeks from now, hopefully by the end of the summer, by the WMO and the WHO. And these two reports are focusing specifically on the working people. So if the audience is looking for the general population or for the elderly, they can find a number of reports by the WHO. If they're looking for solutions for the working population, wait a few days and the ILO report will be published, so you can get a lot of evidence from about the physiology, about the epidemiology, but also the solutions, because this report is primarily geared towards what do we do from now on, how can we address the problem, and I think there's going to be a lot of interesting results there.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really important because the issue is that increased heat is with us now for the long run, and it's unfortunately only going to get worse. So we have to, start finding sort of workable solutions for workers, for people, that they can incorporate in their homes and in their workplaces. So I think that's great that the report is going to focus on solutions. There's another question around what are some of the okay, so there's quite a few questions. Most people are saying that it's been very informative. There's a particular question around the heat impact on cooks, be it male and female, at construction camps. Are there any related findings?
Well, that's a very interesting question. As far as I know, no, but we do have data on cooks in general. So not cooks specifically on construction camps, which I think the situation will be even more. The exposure to heat will be even greater. But I typically show a graph, and we publish this in a report where we compare two different workers, and we compare, they work at exactly the same time, exactly in the same business, the business being a large hotel in South Europe. And we show the core temperature. We give, in our studies, we give people to swallow a pill. It looks like a small vitamin, and the pill records your internal temperature. And then at the end of the work shift, we go close to the workers with a device like a cell phone, and it downloads all the data. So I show a graph showing the core temperature, the body temperature of two workers, one being the chef and the other one being a waiter in the same large restaurant in a large hotel in South Europe. And you can see that the chef's temperature is 1 or 2 degrees higher compared to the waiter, because the waiter is working in the sala where there's air conditioning. Of course, they work hard. They have to walk up and down fast, but the chef is on top of stoves, working in very high humidity, very high radiant heat. So he has a lot of heat radiated to him from his working environment, and he's surpassing the safety threshold set by the WHO more than 90% of his work shift. Whereas the other worker working exactly the same business has zero time beyond the safety limit. So cooks are definitely one of the working population that is one of the working groups that are more vulnerable because of their job. And if they have other factors that make them even more susceptible, such as if they're women or if they have any other personal or pharmacological or health factor, that makes them even more vulnerable to heat-related illness.
Okay, thank you. No, one of the things when we started doing this, putting together this technical assistance project, I interviewed some people in Korea who have been doing this research and looking at heat. I think Korea has generally very good early warning systems that actually incorporate heat alerts. And so one of the people that I spoke to actually talked about cooks as being in Korea, one of the sort of most vulnerable populations due to heat stress. And there's been some research if this is an issue. I mean, it's not construction camps, but if this is an issue of interest, that you may find something related, some research related to cooks in Korea and heat stress. So we have lots of really interesting questions. I'm trying not to miss any questions, but there was one question from Rohit is whether you know of occupation-based guidelines in this context, particularly for women workers. And then he also has a question around evidence of heat and mental health. And then finally, he also is asking about a rise in gender-based violence. They've done some surveys in India and Bangladesh where they have seen sort of a rise in gender-based violence. So I'm just going to stop there. There's a couple more questions, but I'll stop there.
Very, very important points, all of them. First, in the ILO report to be published next week, we are just touching upon the issue of how to address the vulnerability of women. There's one or two pages on this, and within a 100-page report. So there are some superficial information there, some general initial information, and I was really happy to see that the ADB is moving towards that, because I think this is an important gap to address. So the ILO report is mentioning the problem, but is not focusing too much on it. So unfortunately, there's not much, as far as I know, there's not much there yet. We do know that they're more vulnerable, but there's very little research done about how to address this vulnerability, especially for women workers. There is some evidence, but still we haven't analyzed them enough, and there's more research to be done. And now, with regards to mental health effects, in the report, again, we're showing that indeed heat exposure at work, but also in general, is linked with important, significant mental health effects. Many workers who are working in a hot environment, they report much higher prevalence of a number of mental health outcomes, including suicide. And this is mentioned in the ILO report to be published next week. And this includes also violence. So although there's not specifically mentioning in the ILO report about gender-based violence, there is a link about heat exposure at the workplace and increasing violence. So therefore, I would not be surprised to find also that there is gender-based violence as well, and there's an impact there on heat. But the ILO report does not cover it, and this is something that I'm really looking forward to digging further into in the ADB report in the next few months.
Yeah, so just to update those on the call, Andreas will be working with us on putting together a regional report on gender and heat stress. And one of the issues that we're looking at women's health, we're looking at labor productivity, as well as gender-based violence. So these are all sort of issues that we'll be looking at in the next 6 months. So as we were talking, one of the things that I think you touched on is the ability of people, like how it impacts cognitive ability. And since we're talking about workplaces, are there any, I've seen a few studies on sort of people's ability to solve problems, how it impacts students in a learning environment, and test scores. If during a heat wave, students are writing tests, they do much worse during times when there's increased heat. So are there studies about sort of numbers of accidents that happen in the workplace that are sort of heat related, because people's sort of cognitive ability is affected?
There is a little bit of research there, and it's mentioned in the report that I mentioned a number of times, the ILO report. Unfortunately, there's not as much as we would like, because in an accident, it's tough to analyze what were the reasons why the accident happened and to prove whether it was heat related or not. However, there is a few original studies, reports, and papers that have been published on this, and they're highlighted in the report. We do know that our nervous system is I would say the Achilles tendon, the most vulnerable system in our body for heat. Other systems, such as the muscle loves heat. The muscle works much better if it's hot, and that's why we have athletes do a warm-up, because the muscles work much better when they're hot. But our brain and our nervous system is the first one that collapses when we're exposed to heat. And if we have a heat stroke, the first sign of heat stroke is neurological dysfunction. The person would either faint or would have spasms or would be in delirium and start yelling for no reason. So our nervous system breaks down, and this is the first sign, of course, with somebody having higher core temperature, is these two, higher core temperature and neurological dysfunction, are the two diagnostic criteria for heat stroke, which means that our brain doesn't like heat at all. Same thing with our computers. They break down with heat. So we know for sure, as you said correctly, that when somebody's temperature is rising, their ability to analyze the environment, the ability to respond to things, their reaction time, the analysis capacity, the cognitive function are deteriorating very significantly. And this, of course, affects workers, because workers need to be alert throughout all the time. Think about, for example, recently we talked a lot here in South Europe about, and also in Southeast Asia as well, about delivery workers and those who drive small mopeds and have to deliver people's food and parcels. And when they are in a very hot environment, they also face the wind coming towards them. And when the temperature of the wind is higher than the temperature of our skin, the wind is actually not cooling us down, but heating us up. It's like having a hair dryer blowing in your face all the time. So these people have to wear protective clothing, like a helmet and appropriate clothing. They have to be alert all the time. They are exposed to the heat from the environment, and they're being blown hot air during their driving. So you can understand how much this impacts them, and they have to at the same time be fully active and alert because they're driving through traffic. So you can understand this is a very bad, dangerous cocktail of factors, and makes people more likely to engage into an accident, of course.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. We have a question from our colleague here at ADB, Louise McSorley, and she asks, when you control for cardiovascular fitness, body mass, and general fitness, do the sex-based disparities still stand, not including pregnancy?
Yes, it does. It depends. In some studies are showing that maybe it doesn't, but many others are showing that it does. There are many factors that go into play here. It's not only the aerobic fitness, but it's also the what we call the body surface area. It's also the as I said before, the percent body fat. There's also the capacity to sweat. But I understand the question from a physiological point of view. So if I was talking to somebody in a physiology conference, for example, then this would be important, because indeed, when we're looking at the mechanisms, we need to control for everything and to make sure that somebody's vulnerability is specifically because of an issue. But we do know, in a real situation, controlling for things is not necessarily showing the true aspect of how life is. If a female worker has less fitness, if a female worker has more body fat, less body surface area, they wear more clothing, they have a smaller body size, then and they sweat less because of their physiology, then this makes them more vulnerable. So the question is, I understand the question from a physiological point of view, but from a real life point of view, trying to control for everything else so that we are not really seeing the looking at the tree and not the forest is I think not so relevant here. If we see that a certain population group is more vulnerable to heat, then this needs to be addressed. Of course, we need to understand the mechanisms so that we can address the issue in the best possible way. But if they are more vulnerable, they need to be recognized as such, and they need to be protected as such.
Thank you very much. So we have lots of questions. I'm looking at the we have about 10 more minutes, so I think I will just quickly read through them and try to get as many as possible. So from Chela Alexis Cortez, she's working in public works and highways in a developing country, and heat is a constant factor that should be considered by workers, especially engineers doing field work. She would like to know what resources are available, what steps can my department administrations take to bring more awareness regarding this concern. Any leads are well appreciated. So some comments around looking forward to the ILO report. A couple of people have posted, or someone has posted a resource. Then there's a comment around data invisibility or insufficient data regarding studies such as the one presented. So as a regular citizen, how can we avoid aid in providing strong and valid data for this issue? Sing Reng is asking, given female physiology, ADB projects should not request high women participation in certain activities such as construction. I think that is, yeah, so I'm gonna stop there. And I'll let you answer, yeah, if you want to answer some of those, but I'd also like to respond to the question by Sinren. So over to you.
Yeah, let me see if I hope I'm not going to forget some. If I do, please let me know. With regards to the guidance out there, like I said, for general population guidance, there's many wonderful reports from a number of organizations. Also, don't forget that sometimes countries provide very good evidence. So there may be some very good country level reports and guidance that you can find. From an international perspective, WHO and WMO, the World Health Organization and World Meteorological Organization, have published wonderful reports for the general public and for certain specific groups, such as the elderly. Now, for workers, you can find some in the report that I mentioned that was published in April. There is some initial evidence there and some general guidance. The chapter on heat is relatively short. It mainly shows grows the appetite for the report to be published next week. So you can start with that. Look at that report shows you some of the evidence, the epidemiological evidence, but also some of the solutions. And then next week, wait for the one to be published next week to look at specifically in depth with maps, epidemiological evidence. What are the solutions? What our countries are doing around the world? Maybe the country that you're in. We analyze the different legislations. We look at what is common, what is not common, what is evidence-based and what is not evidence-based. And then we look at what countries and organizations can do in different parts of the world to address the problem. We don't go so much in detail about specific groups, although we do mention them, and we do tackle a number of the issues based on the evidence that we have so far. And that's why I said this report, hopefully by the ADB, will address a very important gap in gender aspects. I'm not sure if I addressed all the questions or not.
Yeah, so thank you for that. If I may take sort of the question around, women's physiology, and then they should not be included in construction. I think the idea of this is not to argue that women should not be involved in certain activities. I think the idea is to say, women may have different needs in terms of working outdoors that we need to be aware of and sort of provide support and protection accordingly. And so we need to understand sort of what those are. Just like, we have in research, we don't say, well, women are affected differently by, a certain medication or cancer treatment because they have sort of more adverse impacts from receiving that cancer treatment, so they won't get cancer treatment. That's not the idea. The idea is to figure out sort of how, women and men's sort of needs are different, and then we can sort of properly design projects and working conditions to accommodate everyone. So one of
If
the
I can
yes,
I
please.
add before you move to another
Yes.
topic? Sorry, I missed that. I'm sorry, I missed that point. I want to add something important here also. We're doing an analysis now after collecting data in more than 10 countries around the world, where we look at very carefully at what people are doing every second of their work shift. And we've gathered gigabytes and gigabytes of data on every person's work shift. We have more than a few thousand people's analysis of work shifts. And we wanted to, in one of the analyses that we're doing, and we are going to be publishing it in the next few months, we wanted to look at the effects of age, because we know that elderly are more vulnerable, as I mentioned before. And so there's a similar discussion as the one that you just brought up. What do we do? Do we just remove the elderly from places that are hot, or what do we do about it? And interesting finding that we found in this analysis to be published soon is that we noticed what happens with people taking a break during work if they work in a construction or an agricultural field outside a manual labor. We noticed that the elderly person, and by elderly, sorry, I mean older worker, not elderly, older worker, so both between 50 and 65. So older workers, when we looked at when they take breaks, we found that they are the ones to take break at the exact correct hour. And without knowing, of course, through experience, they take break when they have to, and they take breaks as long as is needed, not too long, not too short. And interestingly enough, we looked at the workers that are around them, and we noticed that when the older worker is taking a break, the younger ones are following suit, and they follow them. So in fact, it shouldn't be that older workers should not be at a construction site, or they should be removed from these places, but in fact that we should keep them there. We should keep them well protected, because they are role models and they have the experience to tell others how to protect themselves and how to work more effectively. So when we have somebody with vulnerability, we shouldn't remove them from the site. We should make sure that they're protected, and we take advantage of other experiences that they have and that they can share with the rest of their team.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have just a couple of minutes left, but just I think two people have commented on interesting sort of adaptation practices. One of them actually is Tatiana. I think she's from Tajikistan, and she mentions that women, when asked about wearing more clothing and working in hot weather, they responded that when they wear more clothes, they sweat more, and it helps to cool them down. We actually heard this in Cambodia as well, when we spoke with both for female agricultural workers as well as those working in garment factories. They are of that view. And then the other sort of now measure that people are taking to adapt to increase heat, this is from Ananya Bhatia, is that women have started, or farmers in Vietnam have started planting crops at night to escape the heat. And she's wondering, what kind of long-term impacts can it have on their health? So I think, unfortunately, that's all the questions we're going to get to. But do you want to answer or say something about the last two comments?
Yeah, those two. First, unfortunately, this is the reason why we need better education. It is not correct to say that wearing more clothes will make you cooler. Of course, you have to wear appropriate clothing, and in a number of reports, including the ILO to be published soon, we're giving the recommendations for appropriate clothing during work. So a person should be protecting themselves, for example, from the sun to avoid skin cancer, of course. But wearing excess clothing makes you warmer, increases your body temperature, and that's why you sweat. So the sweating is to reduce the body temperature, and it's a response of the body to try to negate the extra burden, the thermal burden that we added with additional clothing. We've also seen that with migrant workers here in South Europe, especially those coming from Southeast Asia, where they wear excess clothing. And we actually published a paper a few months ago showing where we compared migrants from Southeast Asia compared to migrants from South Europe, and also local residents from South Europe. And we found very important gaps in heat burden, and the clothing was one of the main factors there. So they wear too much clothing, much more than should be, that is needed. The other question was about night shifts, and we're addressing that also in the ILO report. Indeed, changing the timing of the work towards night is a very popular strategy, especially in large factories that don't close, that work 24/7, but also in construction, and as you said, also sometimes in agriculture. And most studies are showing that indeed some of the thermal burden is reduced, although let's not forget that, as I think somebody did mention, we have the heat islands in the cities, the urban heat islands, that unfortunately make sure that temperature is high even during the night. So in general, the heat is less during the night, but not always. But then you have another problem. You solve a problem, or at least you minimize a problem, but then you start another problem, because working night shifts is associated with a host of health problems, especially for those working many night shifts in a row or for many years in a row.
Right.
So you have both culture, but also health, very chronic, important health problems. So I think from my side, I would say that adopting night shifts would be not the first line of defense, would be further down the line. If we can't address it in any other way, this could be something that could be adopted, but there's better, healthier ways to minimize the issues of heat.
No, thank you. That's really important. And it's a very helpful way of thinking about it, particularly as you know, our team is actually headed to Tajikistan this weekend. And so this has given us some good food for thought, and some, you know, questions or things that we might consider or raise with people when we talk to them there. We're unfortunately a couple minutes over time. This has been a really fantastic discussion. Thank you, everyone that has joined us. My apologies that we did not have a chance to get to all the questions. Some of them or all of them have been really insightful. We have, unfortunately, a question we didn't get to around the combined effects of heat and pollution. I think that's a good topic for another discussion at another time. So I think we'll try to plan for that. But thank you, Andreas. We have a comment from Antoine Morel, who says, excellent presentation, a perfect way to start the weekend. Many thanks. So thank you for sending us off to the weekend with lots of food for thought. So everyone, again, wish you a great weekend. And we also have posted in here a link to our microsite, which has a sign up for further information form. So if you'd like to receive sort of regular updates about our work in this space, please go to our microsite, check it out, send us some feedback, and also sign up for our mailing list. So thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Johnny, and thank you everybody for great questions, great discussion.
All right. See you till next time.